When Keanu Reeves walked onto the set of the Steve Harvey show, the energy was light. The audience expected charm, laughs, and maybe a few behind-the-scenes stories from Hollywood. And Steve, he was ready to guide the conversation with his usual humor and heart. But as Keanu took his seat, something shifted when Steve noticed the simple, small cross necklace resting against his chest. The tone, the air, the purpose itself. What began as a friendly interview was about to become something deeper, because in the next few minutes, Keanu wouldn't be the one answering the questions. Steve Harvey would be the one trying to hold back tears. What Keanu would say would change everything, and it started with just one unexpected sentence. "Can I tell you something I've never revealed in public? Oh, and before we take off, tell us where you're reading this from." We love seeing your reactions. The studio lights dimmed slightly as the crowd settled, the anticipation palpable in the air. The familiar rhythm of Steve Harvey's theme song faded as he walked across the stage with that iconic half grin, cue cards in hand, eyes full of warmth. Tonight was different from the very first second. Steve knew it. The energy felt less like entertainment and more like something sacred was about to unfold. With his voice full of admiration, Steve introduced his guest not just as a Hollywood star, but as something rarer, a soul people felt connected to without ever having met. "The media calls him the kindest man in Hollywood," Steve announced to a chorus of applause. "The internet says he's the last good guy left. Me," he said, "I say he's the realest example of grace I've ever seen." The crowd roared as Keanu Reeves stepped onto the stage. He was dressed in his usual understated style. Dark jeans, a black shirt, and a plain blazer. Nothing flashy, just him. And there, against the dark shirt, rested the small, simple silver cross. He waved briefly, smiled softly, and gave a slight nod, visibly uncomfortable with the overwhelming attention. As he sat down beside Steve, the energy in the room shifted again. Less show, more truth. There was no rush, no performance, just presence. Keanu spoke quietly, almost as if trying not to disturb the peace in the room. He thanked the audience, then admitted, half laughing, half shy, that this kind of reception always caught him off guard. "I'm just a guy trying to do his best," he said. Steve leaned in with a grin. "That's exactly what makes you special." They began to talk not just about film roles and Hollywood gossip, but about humanity, about kindness, about what it meant to move through the world without armor, even when the world gave you every reason to wear it. Steve brought up Keanu's reputation, the videos of him giving up his subway seat, helping crew members on set, giving away portions of his salary to support stuntmen, camera operators, even makeup artists. All true, Keanu confirmed, but he didn't see them as grand acts. "To me," he said gently, "it's just the right thing to do." He spoke with a sort of quiet wisdom, never dramatic, never self-important, and the audience hung on every word. "Everybody's going through something," he added. "Sometimes the smallest gesture can change someone's entire day." Steve nodded deeply, moved. There was something humbling about hearing those words from someone who had every reason to detach, to hide behind status and fame. Yet here he was, bare, honest, open. The conversation turned to contrast. How could someone who had seen so much success remain so grounded? "I guess I've always felt that none of this is promised," Keanu said. "I've lost a lot. When you lose people you love, when life shakes you to the core, you realize that none of it, makes you better than anyone." He paused for a moment, his eyes drifting off camera, maybe into a memory. "I grew up moving around a lot," he continued. "Born in Lebanon, raised in Canada. My father left when I was young. My sister battled leukemia. I lost my partner. I lost a child. And still, I'm here. Every day is a choice. You either let pain harden you, or you let it shape you into someone softer." The words settled like a weight on the room. You could feel it, people holding their breath, reflecting on their own pain. Steve was visibly moved. His fingers made a subtle gesture toward the small cross on Keanu's chest. Then he hesitated, looking with respectful curiosity. "That necklace," Steve said finally, his voice soft. "It caught my eye. It must have meaning for you." Keanu nodded, his gaze dropping to his own chest, his fingers instinctively touching the cross. "Yes," he said calmly, "it does. Silence has been my companion for a long time. But in that silence, sometimes I hear the clearest things." Steve leaned back slightly, his voice softening even more. "You ever hear God in that silence?" Keanu paused, really paused. Then he looked Steve directly in the eyes. "Yes," he said, "I believe in something greater. I've questioned it, I've walked away from it, I've felt alone. But even in the deepest darkness, I could feel something. A presence, a peace. Not always loud, not always comforting, but always there." Steve took a deep breath. "That's faith," he said quietly. "Even if it doesn't have a name, even if it's just something you feel." Keanu looked at the cross now, his expression shifting. He leaned forward slightly, almost hesitating, like he was about to step off a ledge. "Steve," he said, his voice lower now, full of something different, something deeper. "Can I tell you something I've never said out loud in public before?" Steve didn't speak, he just nodded. Keanu took a long, intentional breath. "There was a night," he began, "a few years ago. I was in a really dark place. Couldn't move, couldn't eat, couldn't sleep. I wasn't even sure I wanted to be alive. Everything felt empty. The audience was utterly silent. I was scrolling through my phone," he continued, "just trying to distract myself, trying to feel something, and I came across a video. It was you." Steve froze. "Talking about purpose, about faith, about how God doesn't waste pain." Keanu added, "But it wasn't just what you said. It was how you said it, like you lived it. And I was wearing this necklace then," he said, taking the cross between his fingers. "And I remember thinking, this man believes in something bigger. Maybe I can too." Steve slowly looked down at the cross on Keanu's chest, feeling the echoes within himself. "I watched that clip 3 times, Keanu whispered. "And the next morning, for the first time in weeks, I got out of bed." He sat back slowly, almost as if the memory itself had weight. "I've never told anyone that," he said, "but I've carried your words with me ever since." Steve didn't speak for a long moment. When he did, his voice cracked. "I was just talking from the heart," he said. "I had no idea." Keanu interrupted him gently. "That's just it. You didn't have to know. That's what made it real. You weren't trying to inspire me. You were just being yourself. And that saved me." Emotions were swelling in Steve's eyes now. The studio lights reflected off a tear that escaped down his cheek. "And this cross you wear," Keanu said, his voice now full of reverence. "It's not just a symbol. It's a sign, a message, an anchor I held on to when I felt most lost." Steve looked at him, confused but open. "You think you're just a comedian with faith," Keanu said. "But Steve, I think you're something else." Steve looked puzzled. "I think you're a minister in disguise," Keanu said. "And I have something else to tell you. Something that might change your life, the way you changed mine." The studio was silent. Even the camera seemed to pause. And Steve, still looking at Keanu's cross, whispered one word. "I'm listening." There was a silence on stage that didn't feel like television anymore. Not a pause between laughs, not a dramatic beat. It was something else, something deeper. The kind of silence that only shows up when truth steps into the room. Keanu Reeves had leaned in towards Steve Harvey, eyes sincere, voice soft but unwavering. "Can I tell you something I've never revealed in public?" he had asked, and Steve, surprised but steady, had given him space. Now Keanu sat back in his chair, adjusting slightly, like someone about to open a door that had remained closed for too long. The audience was utterly still, no whispers, no fidgeting, just pure human attention. Keanu took a slow breath. His eyes didn't wander, they stayed locked on Steve, but what he was seeing was far away. "There was a season in my life," he began, "when I couldn't find a reason to wake up." Steve didn't flinch, but his body stilled, as if his soul had leaned forward. "I had lost people," Keanu continued, "not just to death, to life, to time, to pain, one after the other." His voice was calm, but each word seemed to echo off the walls of something buried. "My daughter was stillborn," he said gently, "and just a few weeks later, I lost Jennifer. She was the closest thing I had to home. He paused, then looked down at his hands for a moment. I don't think I cried right away. Grief isn't always loud. Sometimes it's quiet. So quiet you forget you're alive. The audience sat breathless. Some leaned forward, some leaned into themselves. I kept working, he said. Kept doing interviews, kept playing roles. Because it's easier to disappear behind a character than to be yourself when yourself is broken. Steve's fingers again drifted towards the site of Keanu's cross. Not for show, just instinct, just grounding. But eventually, Keanu went on, the noise outside couldn't drown out the silence inside. And one night, that silence almost won. Steve tilted his head, his eyes searching Keanu's face for what was coming. It was late, Keanu said. I was alone. I hadn't slept in days. I didn't want to eat. I didn't want to talk. I didn't want to be. So I sat there in the dark, just sitting for hours. A long pause. No prayers, no thoughts. Just the thought after all thoughts. That kind of emptiness. Then something in his tone shifted, barely. And that's when it happened, he said. I picked up my phone, just scrolling. Not looking for anything, just trying not to feel. He breathed in slowly. And I saw a clip. It was you. Steve blinked, visibly caught off guard. You were on stage, Keanu said, talking about storms, about how God doesn't waste pain, about how sometimes the thing that's breaking you is actually breaking you open. Steve nodded slowly. He remembered the moment. I don't know why I stopped scrolling, Keanu admitted, but I watched the whole thing, and then I watched it again. His voice cracked just slightly. You said, if you're still breathing, it means God's not finished with you yet. And for some reason, that sentence hit different. It felt like someone finally saw me. Not the actor, not the man in headlines, just the man in the dark. Steve exhaled softly, his hand now resting fully over his heart, as if feeling the warmth of Keanu's cross on his own chest. Keanu leaned forward now, elbows on his knees, voice almost a whisper. And I need you to know, Steve, that night, I stood up. He let that sit for a moment. Not because I was healed, not because I suddenly had answers, but because for the first time in a long time, I felt seen, and that was enough to make me move. The words struck Steve right in the chest. He didn't hide it. His eyes were wet, his lips pressed together, trembling slightly. Keanu looked at him with a mix of gratitude and reverence. I never meant to tell this story, and he said, but sitting here looking at you, I realized I had to. Steve's voice came slowly, thick with emotion. Man, I don't even know what to say. You don't have to say anything, Keanu replied. You already did. Years ago. He gestured toward his chest. And this cross I wear, that's what caught my eye first. Before your words, before your message, that symbol in that moment was a lighthouse. Steve's gaze dropped again to Keanu's cross, questioning the power of his own faith. I kept watching your message over the next few days, Keanu said, not because it fixed me, but because it reminded me that healing doesn't require answers, just hope. The audience was still quiet, some now visibly emotional. A few wiped their eyes, others simply sat absorbing. Steve leaned back, swallowing hard. You think you're just talking, Keanu said, just entertaining, just surviving. But that night, you were doing more than that. You were lifting someone who didn't have the strength to stand. Steve closed his eyes for a second, taking it in. I needed to tell you, Keanu continued, because the world knows you as a host, a comedian, a motivator. But I don't think that's the full truth. Steve looked back at him, still stunned. I think, Keanu said slowly, you're a minister in disguise. A long silence followed. Steve's eyes filled again. He shook his head softly. Not in denial, more like disbelief, humble disbelief. You ever wonder why people are drawn to you? Keanu asked. All the time, Steve admitted. Keanu smiled gently. It's because they're not just hearing your voice, they're feeling your spirit. You carry something sacred, man. Steve laughed a short, broken laugh. I'm just trying to make it, like everyone else. That's what makes it real, Keanu said. You're not trying to be anything other than who you are, and because of that, you reach people you'll never meet. He looked toward the audience now. People in rooms like this, People on the other side of a screen, people sitting in silence, like I was. Then he turned back to Steve. And I know, it's hard sometimes carrying that kind of weight, not knowing if what you're doing even matters. Steve nodded slowly, visibly affected. But I'm here to tell you, Keanu said, it does. And just when the moment seemed to reach its emotional peak, Keanu's expression changed slightly, but undeniably. More serious, more intentional. He leaned in, lowering his voice. Steve, this cross I wear, it's not just a symbol. It's a sign, a message. And tonight I have something to tell you, something that might change your life, the way you changed mine. Steve looked up, startled by the shift. The crowd leaned in, sensing it too. What do you mean? Steve asked softly. Keanu's eyes didn't blink. I've held these words for years, he said. They came from you. And tonight I need to say them back to you. Steve sat still, breathing unevenly. Keanu nodded once. Because I think you may have forgotten the power they hold. The weight of the moment hung thick in the air. Steve Harvey sat frozen, eyes still fixed on Keanu Reeves, who had just leaned in with a calm, unwavering voice and said, Tonight, I need to say those words back to you, because I think you may have forgotten the power they hold. The studio was silent. Even the background hum of the cameras seemed to fade. Keanu sat up straighter, breathing deeply as though preparing to revisit a sacred memory. I remember the lighting in the video, he began. It wasn't perfect. It was a little grainy. You were on stage holding a mic in one hand, your other hand resting right over your chest, over that cross. Steve nodded slowly, already feeling the emotion swell inside him. You were talking about purpose, Keanu continued, but not in some polished, rehearsed way. It was like you were fighting through your own story while sharing it. You said, pain has a language. When someone who's been through something speaks, it cuts through the noise. He paused, locking eyes with Steve. And then you said something that stayed with me. God doesn't always call the qualified. He qualifies the called. Steve's lips parted just barely. His hand went to his chest again, as if feeling the weight of the faith Keanu described. You said that God uses ordinary people to do extraordinary things, Keanu added. That even if you think you're just telling jokes, just paying bills, just trying to make it to tomorrow, God might be using that right there to change someone's life. Steve leaned forward, elbows on his knees now. That old clip was coming back to him, the one he had recorded years ago after a show when he had hit a low point and decided to speak from his soul, no script. And I realized something that day, Keanu said. It wasn't just your words, it was the way you said them. You believed them. And that belief, it lit something in me. He looked down for a second, his voice softening. I had lost my sense of direction, the grief, the silence. It had buried my compass. But when I heard those words and saw the way you carried them, he touched his own cross. It reminded me that even in my lowest moment, I wasn't invisible. He looked back up at Steve. You were a stranger to me, but in that moment, you became a beacon. Steve let out a long breath, the kind that comes from the chest and carries years of weight. Keanu smiled gently. And that's the thing about beacons. They don't always know who's watching. They just keep shining. There was a long pause, not awkward, not uncomfortable, just full. Full of what had been said, full of what hadn't yet been said. Then Steve spoke, his voice lower than before. You know, sometimes I wonder if I've done enough, he admitted. If all this comedy, hosting, speaking, actually means something. Keanu leaned in slightly. It does. I'm living proof. Steve shook his head, overwhelmed. I was just trying to survive, man. I wasn't trying to save anyone. And that, Keanu said, is exactly why you did. The audience stirred, small sounds of emotion breaking through the stillness. A few people wiped their eyes, others simply sat in quiet reverence. Steve looked out toward the crowd, then back at Keanu. You said something changed in you when you saw that video, he said. What was it? Keanu sat with the question for a moment, then replied, Hope, he said, that maybe the silence wasn't the end of my story, that maybe, just maybe, God still had something for me to do. He looked directly at Steve again. And this cross on my chest, he said, holding the necklace. While you spoke about divine purpose, it wasn't just a coincidence. It was confirmation. A quiet reminder that light finds a way in, even through a screen. Steve nodded slowly, visibly moved. You reminded me, Keanu added, that I wasn't forgotten, that my story wasn't over. He paused again, letting the moment breathe. And I remember exactly what you said, Steve. Word for word. I've carried it with me for years, and tonight I need to say it back to you, because maybe you've forgotten how powerful it really is. Steve looked at him, a question forming in his eyes. Keanu took a deep breath, eyes steady. Sometimes you're not the one being rescued, you're the one doing the rescuing, and you don't even know it. Steve's lips trembled slightly. You think you're just talking, but you're actually testifying. Keanu leaned back slightly, giving the moment space to land. Steve covered his face with his hands for a second. Then he looked up, eyes glistening. You remembered all that? He asked. I needed to, Keanu said simply, because I wasn't just hearing you. I was being lifted by you. Steve sat back in his chair, hands clasped now, as if trying to hold himself together. The room felt like it had shifted again. More than just a stage, more than just a show. It felt like healing was happening right there, under the lights. Keanu's voice came one last time, softer than before. And maybe you don't hear this enough, but Steve, you matter. Not for what you do, but for who you are. You carried faith into places where people had none left, including me. Steve couldn't respond right away. His chest rose and fell with slow, emotional breaths. The moment was quiet until Keanu added, almost in a whisper, and today I have something to tell you. That might change your life, just like you changed mine. Steve looked up, and the entire studio held its breath. For a long moment, Steve Harvey said nothing. He simply sat there, absorbing everything Keanu had just shared, the gratitude, the testimony, the truth. Then slowly, Keanu leaned forward again, this time with a different presence, as if what he was about to say didn't come from memory, but from something sacred. I remember every word of that message, he said, and I want to say them back to you now, not just as a reminder, but as a mirror. Steve's eyes locked on his, unmoving, and then with calm reverence, Keanu began to recite, God doesn't always use the mighty or the perfect. Sometimes he picks the broken, the ones nobody expects, because they know how to reach people the strong can't. Steve blinked slowly, the words washing over him like a tide he'd forgotten how to stand against. You don't need a pulpit to preach. You don't need a robe to be called. You don't need a church to carry the word. Keanu's voice didn't waver. He wasn't quoting a clip anymore. He was delivering a message. Sometimes your pain is your ministry, and sometimes your comedy is just the disguise God uses to send people hope. Steve's lips parted, but no sound came out. He was completely undone. Then Keanu looked at him gently, like someone delivering a revelation instead of a compliment. You thought you were just making people laugh, he said, but you were doing more than that. You were reaching hearts. You were saving lives. You were carrying light. He let those words settle before adding the one line that would break Steve's composure. You're a minister, Steve. You just happened to wear a suit instead of a collar. Steve's head dropped. One hand went to his face. The other looked towards Keanu's cross, as if questioning his own faith. Tears spilled freely now. No shame, no restraint. The audience didn't move. No applause, just silence. Sacred, still, holy silence. And then Keanu said something else. Soft, almost fragile. This cross I wear, he said, touching his own necklace. It's not just a symbol, Steve. It's a signal. And tonight, I think it's pointing at something bigger than both of us. Steve looked up, tears still falling. Keanu inhaled deeply, as if steadying himself for what came next. Because tonight, I have something to tell you. Something that may change your life. Steve's expression shifted, equal parts fear and awe. Keanu leaned in, voice quiet but certain. Just like you changed mine. Steve slowly wiped his face, his hand trembling slightly as he lowered it from his eyes. The tears hadn't fully stopped, but now they mingled with a kind of stillness, a reverence that made even the lights on set seem softer. Keanu sat quietly across from him, as if waiting for the right moment to speak. And then, with a gentle exhale, he said it. Steve, there's something I need to tell you, a sentence that's lived inside me for years, and I've never said it out loud until now. Steve nodded slowly, his eyes searching Keanu's. His voice was barely above a whisper. Go ahead. Keanu leaned forward. There was no performance in his voice, only truth. God uses his chosen ones, he began, even when they think they're just telling jokes. Steve blinked, not moving. Keanu continued. You thought you were just entertaining, just trying to bring people joy. But Steve, you were saving lives. A single tear slipped down Steve's cheek again. This one different. This one carried understanding. Keanu nodded, confirming it with a look that said, This is real. You saved mine, he said softly. And for a moment, no one in the room breathed. Even the cameras felt like they bowed their heads. Steve leaned back, a sound escaping his lips. Part laugh, part sob, part disbelief. I was just trying to make it, man, he said. Trying to get through my pain, like everybody else. Keanu nodded again. Exactly, that's what made it holy. The words lingered, deep, permanent. Then something happened that no one expected. Steve stood up. His body shook, not from weakness, but from something else, something sacred. He didn't speak. He simply looked at Keanu, at the cross on his chest, then touched his own heart. Keanu stood still, face to face with Steve Harvey. Both men now on their feet. The studio was frozen in time. Steve had just asked a question that came not from doubt, but from deep, aching wonder. Why me? And Keanu had answered without hesitation. I'll tell you. He didn't rush. He let the air carry the silence as if inviting heaven itself into the conversation. Because God chooses the unlikely, Keanu said gently, the ones who've been overlooked, the ones who've bled quietly behind the curtain. He chooses people who felt pain because they know how to speak to the pain of others. Steve didn't move. His eyes glistened with something older than tears, something sacred. You're not the loudest, Keanu continued. You're not the most polished. You didn't go to seminary. You didn't memorize scripture. But God saw your scars and trusted you with a microphone anyway. And then, in the middle of that quiet storm, Steve whispered, But why me? His voice cracked open on those two words. Why me, man? Out of everybody God could have used, why would he pick me? Keanu stood up too, his eyes steady. He said nothing for a moment. Then he took a step closer, stopping just in front of Steve, and replied, I'll tell you. The camera pushed in slowly. The audience didn't move. No one said a word. Because they knew whatever Keanu was about to say next wasn't just for Steve, it was for all of them. Why would he pick me? Steve asked. Keanu stepped forward. I'll tell you. The crowd was still. Some wept silently. Some held hands. No one reached for their phones. No one wanted to leave this moment. Steve finally let out a soft breath. His voice was cracked but steady. I've thought about quitting before, he said. Walking away from the spotlight. From all of it. Keanu nodded as if he already knew. I have too, he replied. More than once. They both sat back down now. Not because the moment passed, but because it had deepened, shifted, settled. Steve leaned forward, elbows on his knees, eyes far off. I've asked God more than once. What do you want from me? He said. Sometimes I feel like I'm not good enough to speak on faith. Not clean enough, not consistent enough. Keanu nodded again, his voice soft and certain. And that's exactly why he chose you. Steve looked up. Because your voice doesn't sound like a preacher's, Keanu said. It sounds like someone who's been through it. Someone who knows what it's like to lose, to struggle, to cry in the dark. There was no applause, no music, just presence. Then Steve looked at Keanu, eyes sharp with something else now, something searching. Do you really believe, he asked, that we can still have faith in a world like this? The question hung in the air, heavy, timeless. And the way Keanu looked back at him, calm, sure, almost glowing with something beyond himself, told everyone in the room that what he was about to say next would not be forgotten. Steve asked, Do you really believe we can still have faith in a world like this? Keanu looked at him, ready to answer. and what he said next would become one of the most replayed lines in television history. Steve's question lingered in the air like incense. Keanu didn't answer right away. He simply looked at Steve, calm but intense, as if the words needed to form in his soul before they reached his lips. Then finally he spoke. "I believe faith is the only thing that isn't pretending." Steve tilted his head, listening. "In Hollywood, we follow scripts," Keanu said. "On camera, everything is written, edited, controlled. We rehearse pain, we fake joy. But faith," he paused, "faith has no director. It demands truth. It demands surrender." He leaned in slightly, voice softer now, but more powerful. "Faith isn't glamorous. It doesn't win awards. It's not invited to after parties, but it saves people. Quietly, deeply, forever." Steve nodded slowly, his heart in his throat. "Hollywood shows you how to act," Keanu continued, "but faith shows you how to live." A ripple moved through the audience. Not a sound, but an energy, a shift. "Faith is the only path," Keanu said, "that has no spotlight, no camera, no applause. It's the one place where it's just you and God." Steve couldn't speak. He simply placed his hand over his heart and nodded, overcome. "I didn't grow up with religion," Keanu admitted, "but I've come to believe that faith is real. Not because someone preached it to me, but because it met me in the silence. It met me when the lights were off and no one else was around." He looked at Steve, eyes full of something eternal. "And it met me through you," he said, looking into Steve's eyes. "Not the Hollywood version of you, the real you, the broken but still standing version. The man with the courage to speak life into a stranger through a screen." Keanu stood up, and after a beat, Steve stood with him. They looked at each other for a long moment. Two men, two lives shaped by pain, now bound by grace. Then Keanu stepped forward and opened his arms. Steve walked in without hesitation. They embraced. Not as actor and host, but as brother and brother. The audience stood slowly, reverently. No one clapped yet. It didn't feel right to interrupt the sacred. Finally, Steve turned to the crowd, his voice cracked but full of spirit. "I've had a lot of moments on this stage," he said, "but this was the greatest gift I've ever received." He closed his eyes for a second, then lifted his head and, with sincerity, he whispered, "Let's pray." In that studio, in front of millions of viewers, two men with stories of pain became instruments of healing, and for a moment, the world believed again.